Hey, George Haas here. Wanted to continue talking about meditation interventions for the addiction process. Maybe talk about Module 3 today, persistent negative emotion. When you look at the way that the body-mind stores emotion in the body, um, you may discover it or may already be aware of it as these emotional centers. They tend to be in a specific location, a specific size and shape that you can track. And they tend to have one flavor of emotion that's in them. And when they start releasing emotion, they can release slowly over a long period of time pretty intense emotions. Uh, a lot of people like to suppress them. A lot of people have constant awareness of them. Um, if you look at the way in which these somaticized emotional experiences begin to fill, what you're looking at is something in the present moment that creates an overwhelming experience which is too much for the body-mind to handle. And so the unconscious process of repression takes over. And the experience is then stored in the body, waiting for later processing. In family systems, in particular where there's addiction, often there's no later to begin processing these, so that these emotional events, one after another, are simply stored in the body. The only real research I've seen on it came from the yoga community, that the emotional experiences are stored in the fascia, the connective tissue. This makes sense because often when you locate one of these emotional centers, they don't really map on very well to anatomy. You're familiar with the experience of a pulled muscle or and maybe an ache in one of your organs, maybe bone pain, depending on what happens from your activities in life. And then you discover one of these emotional centers, and it doesn't really lay out very well over the actual anatomy of the body. One explanation for that is that the fascia actually are these wrappings so that they fold over muscle and are in areas rather than in specific locations. So the reason that persistent negative emotion is causal to relapse is that the constant release of, say, terrible sadness or fear or anger, if it goes on for too long, just becomes too much of a grind, and the idea then is to escape from it. If you're not aware that this is old stuff that's stored in the body, something happens in the present moment, and you may think that it's the conditions of the present moment that are causing it. And so you want to address in the present moment the conditions to see if you can change it to relieve you from the experience of the difficult emotion, and it has no effect. So in some sense, you have the conditions of the present moment. If they cause an emotional reaction to them and it exceeds the ordinary bandwidth of emotion that you can tolerate, you have an emotional event that needs to be regulated. But what can also happen is that there's a resonance in the pool of poison and pain, kind of Zen poetry is a description of this, the somaticized emotional experience. And that resonance of emotion tends to turbocharge the emotional experience of the present moment. So if in the present moment something causes a sadness to arise and you have a pool of sadness and that pool resonates, you have this turbocharging of sadness. Without good clarity, you may think that the conditions of the present moment are the thing that's causing that intensity of sadness, and then you may demand that the people that you're involved in or the situation you're in address the intensity of that sadness. If you've ever had the experience of people reacting to your reaction as if it were an overreaction, wondering where that's actually coming from, it may be that you have the experience of the pool turbocharging the present moment. So we also then begin to investigate whether or not these somaticized emotional centers that are so intense emotionally were caused by some kind of trauma experience in childhood. So we talk about that in two ways. One is small t trauma, which is developmental trauma, so hundreds or thousands of small events that lead to a trauma response. Or it may be big T trauma, the loss of a parent or sibling or financial situation in the family, or the loss of social position for you in childhood. The inability to process them at the time leads them to be stored in the body for later processing, but if there is no later processing, they just stay there, kind of in stasis, waiting for the opportunity to be released later. So with persistent negative emotion as causal to relapse, the idea then is to use your meditation techniques and strategies to come into awareness of these different emotional centers. Some people are aware of one at a time, some people are aware of multiple centers. Typically, the base emotions, anger, fear, sadness, the release of emotion from the emotional centers is a single emotion. But you can also have emotional centers that are complex in nature. These tend to vary then in the release of emotional that comes out of them. So in the beginning, the idea is to track where these emotional centers are. Maybe you notice a weightiness, a heaviness, a pressure in the body. When you bring your attention to them, you notice that the energy intensifies, a kind of contractive energy, a cramping energy, which can get so intense, almost like a Charlie horse, a muscle pain intensity. That's one aspect of it, the energy. The second aspect then is the release of emotion, and that tends to roll up the body just as any emotion would. So you bring your attention to the emotional center, you track the energy, the intensity of the energy, and then if emotion is released, you track the emotion as it's releasing. I like to recommend that as the wave of emotion completes, that you note gone at the end of that. So in the beginning, you're noting the intensity of the energy. I do that as a basic intensity exercise. Is it the same as the moment before? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Has it vanished? And then as you notice a wave of emotion, noting the emotion itself, if you know the name of it, labeling it by name. If you're aware that there's an emotion there but you're not sure which one it is, you can use the label something or don't know. And following the wave of emotional release until it ends and then noting gone. This is an important way to emphasize the development of equanimity. If you just notice the arisings of the release and you don't pay attention to the endings, it can appear as if it's a constant, continuous release of emotion, and this adds to the distress of it. Where you want to get to is that you can just be in the experience of the emotional center and watch it release with perfect equanimity. I think that a lot of what addiction is a running away from the terrible sadness, for instance, that might be held in the body. And that if you can come into awareness of the emotional center around the terrible sadness and just be with it in equanimity, that a lot of the addictive strategies that you have just fall away because you don't need them for protection anymore. So that's the third module, persistent negative emotion. Thanks.